And on that note, I will now hand over to the next speaker, Roger Helmer, who will tell us how we're going to sort our energy out, or not. Thank you.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Marietta, for that introduction. Delighted to be here in Bourne. I haven't been in Bourne for a little while, so it's nice to be back here. And I want to express my gratitude to the Constituency Association for setting up this evening. I want to express my gratitude to my colleague Stuart Agnew, who's come all the way from Eastern England to talk to us about agriculture. And of course, especially, I'm very proud to be here supporting Marietta as our candidate in this constituency. Well, she's already said some things that have sparked one or two thoughts in my mind. She's mentioned that we're the Marmite Party, you love us or hate us. I've always thought we're the Heineken Party. We reach the parts that other parties can't reach. And really, that is the answer to, I think, all these people who say, well, if I vote this way, or if I vote UKIP, I'll let somebody else in. The fact is, across large parts of southern England, we are the primary challenger to the Conservatives. No, Labour isn't. And across northern England, we are the primary challenger to Labour. And Labour know that, and they are very frightened about it. So it isn't a case of vote UKIP, get somebody else. In fact, if you look at Haywood and Middleton, where we had a by-election just recently, it was a case of vote Conservative, get Labour, because we were a few hundred votes behind Labour in the outcome there. If a few more of those Tories had voted UKIP, they'd have got rid of a Labour MP. So we mustn't listen to these voices that say vote UKIP, you'll let somebody else in. Vote UKIP, you get UKIP. We saw that with the Carswell by-election and the other by-election. So we had two by-elections where we've got very brave and very hard-working UKIP MPs returned to the House of Commons. Now, the other point that Marietta made that I must pick up on is the question of Europe. And people say, oh, well, UKIP, you're only concerned about Europe. And of course, Marietta is absolutely right. We have policies across a huge range of areas. But again, in a sense, we need to be concerned about Europe because Europe is actually driving so many of the other things that we are concerned about. I sat on the Unemployment Committee in the European Parliament for many years. I think they call it the Employment and Social Affairs Committee, but I call it the Unemployment Committee because that's what it creates. And the damage which Europe has done to the labour market in this country, both through over-regulation but also through free movement of people, is enormous. Because, of course, one of the problems with lots and lots of immigrants coming in from Eastern Europe prepared to work on very low wages is it forces down wages generally. And a lot of people at the lower end of the wage scale are doing worse than they ought to because we've invited so many of these people in. And in fact, going back to the racism point, I tell you what, the immigration policy currently operated by this coalition government, that is racist, not in intention, but in effect. And I tell you why. Because Cameron would like to reduce immigration, although he's utterly failed to deliver on his promise to get it down into below 100,000. But what he's doing, he can't control immigration from Europe, so he squeezes immigration from elsewhere. So what we are doing is we are preferring an unskilled and possibly unemployable worker from Eastern Europe rather than a Canadian nuclear physicist or an Indian software engineer or an Australian brain surgeon. We are excluding particularly highly skilled people from the Commonwealth, including countries like India, and we are preferring unskilled people from Europe. That can't make sense. As Marietta says, we want to have an Australian-style immigration policy where we first of all decide how many people we want to let in, and we then let in the people with the skills that British industry needs. That would be a rational immigration policy. But as Marietta said, I'm here to talk about energy, so I apologise for talking about other things first. And one of the reasons I'm keen to talk to you about energy, quite apart from the fact that it happens to be my specialist subject and I'm the spokesman for the party on it, is that it illustrates a point which is so important in the context of Europe. And that is, we get policies imposed on us by Brussels which impact, as I said before, lots of different policy areas. In this case, directly impact energy, and the effect is absolutely perverse. And I'm sure when Stuart speaks to you in a moment, he is going to be able to tell you again that agriculture is agriculture, but it is being damaged by policies in exactly the same way that are being imposed by Brussels. But make no mistake, the energy policy which our government in Britain is pursuing is largely dictated by Brussels. And I will tell you something about that energy policy. It is doing one thing extremely well, and that is undermining competitiveness in British industry, and in fact undermining competitiveness in European industry. And you may say, well, okay, maybe it's doing a bit of economic damage, but is it saving the planet? No, it isn't saving the planet, and I will tell you why. In my view, it could actually be increasing global emissions. Their obsession is reducing CO2 emissions, but the effect of their policy is arguably the reverse. And let me explain why that is. For a start, they're putting up wind farms and solar panels all over the place. Those are intermittent forms of renewable energy. If you have intermittent renewable energy, you need fossil fuel backup so that when the wind goes down, you can ramp up the gas and vice versa. But it's very inefficient to run a gas-fired power station up and down to balance out the wind, and therefore you are burning more fuel and emitting more CO2 from that backup power station than you would be if you were running it properly. And the evidence for that, if you need evidence for it, is that they've actually had to introduce a special subsidy, yet another special subsidy, for the guys running the gas-fired backup, called capacity payments, because you couldn't actually afford, as a business proposition, to run a gas-fired power station that inefficiently unless you had an extra subsidy from the government to do it. That's the first reason why we are not delivering what we thought we were going to deliver. The second reason, though, is this: that there are energy-intensive businesses, and I've spent some time in the last 6 weeks talking to European business industries, including steel and aluminium and petroleum refining and cement and the coal industry, about what they are doing. And what we are seeing there is we are seeing oh dear, never make a speech with a phone. It's absolutely disastrous. I do apologise, and I will turn it off if I can. Yep, it doesn't want to turn off. There we go, power off. Those industries are withdrawing investment from Europe. They are closing down factories in Europe and in the UK. We've had 2 or 3 aluminium plants closed down here. We've had steel plants closed down here. We've had 17 chemical companies close in Britain. And Jim Ratcliffe, who's the CEO of INEOS, that's the big chemical company that has the Grangemouth facility in Scotland, he has actually said, he's one of the biggest players in the business, he said there will be no chemical industry in Europe, he said, in 10 years' time unless we change the energy policy. Because what industry is paying for energy in Europe is more or less double what our major competitors in America, in China, in India, in Korea, in those countries, we are paying double. Now, there are many industries where the energy cost is a substantial chunk of their costs. It can be a third, it can be a half. In fact, in some cases, it's even more than half. Are they going to invest in an area where they pay twice as much for that basic input? No, they're not. You take the glass industry. They're closing factories, glass factories across Europe, and actually investing in places like North Africa, Turkey, Russia. Why are they doing that? Because it's so much cheaper to make glass bottles in those countries and ship them in bulk into Europe rather than to make them here. But, and here is the killer, often when they go to those other countries and other jurisdictions, they have much slacker environmental rules, and they actually produce more CO2 per unit of output than if we'd done it here. I've talked to people in the steel industry. They say a ton of steel in Shanghai involves twice the emissions of a ton of steel made in Sheffield. Now, that's just anecdotal evidence, but we also have a government report prepared by this government, by the British government, looking at the emissions associated with petroleum refining. Now, we are closing down petroleum refineries in Britain, and we are importing more and more from America, from Russia, refined petroleum products, and that government report says that the emissions associated with imported refined petroleum products are 35% higher than if we did it here. So we're destroying jobs, we are closing plants, and we are at the same time increasing emissions. Now, that cannot make any kind of sense. And by the way, it isn't just an issue for industry, although it's a vital issue for industry, and that means jobs, of course, but it's also an issue for households. Have you looked at your energy bills recently? You know, we're all very happy that we're getting our petrol a bit cheaper, and that's great, although we don't know how long it's going to last.
It's going up already. But
it's going up already, as Marietta says. But the cost of the electricity that you buy is far higher than it ought to be. Now, we've had politicians from the old parties, and do you know what they say? They say it's these utility companies, they're profiteering. I don't know whether you saw the British Gas profit figures that were published just literally today in the news today. Their profits have nosedived. They are not profiteering. The reason that your electricity bill is going up is because of all those wind farms and all those solar panels. It's because they closed down the coal-fired power stations which would have delivered reliable, secure electricity, and they're relying on imported products. They're relying on very, very expensive technologies. It's not an act of God, it's not an accident, it's a deliberate policy which they have indulged in. And by the way, I sit on the Energy Committee in Brussels. They're now talking about, I won't go into the detail because it's all too complicated, but it's called a market stability reserve with their emissions trading system. The primary objective of that is to make energy more expensive because they want to stop you using it and they want to stop people creating CO2 emissions. So far from solving the problem, they are actually going on and making matters worse. What we want to do in UKIP, the point I ought to have made, is not only cost but security of supply. 5 years ago, we had a margin of safety on generation. In other words, the generating capacity compared to consumption. The gap was about 17%, which is kind of a comfortable cushion. The last figure I saw was 4%, and people I talk to in the industry reckon that 4% is very, very marginal. We'll be lucky if we don't see any blackouts. Haven't seen too many so far this winter, but we are in danger of actually losing supply. And of course, the time you need most energy in really cold weather, you typically get high pressure across large parts of the UK, no wind, and all those wind farms are sitting there idly. So our position in UKIP is we want secure and affordable energy supplies. To do that, we want to use tried and tested methods to generate electricity, which is going to be primarily coal and gas and nuclear. Now, somebody's going to say, look at Hinkley, the cost of nuclear is too high. It is too high, but the reason it's too high is because Gordon Brown sold off the British nuclear industry and we're obliged to go to foreign suppliers, and because of the regulatory uncertainty created by the political classes. So anybody who is in the business of building a nuclear power station is going to ask for a risk premium. But the policy we will adopt, we will discontinue subsidies for renewables on new projects. They will not be able to get subsidies on new wind farms or new solar panels. And by the way, let me say on solar, we're not against renewables because they're renewable. We're against renewables because they are too expensive. Now, I believe, and I follow these things pretty closely, I think probably in 5 years' time, maybe in 10 years' time, solar will actually be competitive, even allowing for that extra cost of the backup that I was talking about earlier. But I think by then there will be new technologies available, so you won't see, sorry, I don't mean to infringe on your area, Stuart, but you won't see people putting solar panels across prime agricultural land in Lincolnshire. You may see people putting solar panels on the roofs of barns, farmers and so on, but you will also see thin film solar on the windows, south-facing windows of office buildings and apartment buildings and so on. So it will be new technology that will be much more efficient and much less intrusive. And what we will be doing in 10 years' time, we will be saying, why did we invest these enormous amounts of money in those old-fashioned, clunky, imported from China photovoltaic panels that you see all over the place on people's roofs and in people's gardens? We have a plan based on coal, gas and nuclear, which will deliver secure and affordable energy. Unfortunately, we can't deliver that plan as long as Britain is in the European Union. Thank you.